Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video, commenting where you're watching from and at what time, and subscribing to keep these chilling stories coming. Now, let's dive into these unsettling tales. It was a typical Tuesday night in suburban California, quiet, peaceful, and just like any other weeknight. The kind of night where the houses look like they've been set up for a movie scene. Front lawns, perfectly trimmed, the smell of freshly cut grass still lingering in the cool evening air, and streetlights glowing softly in the distance, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. The temperature had dropped just enough for a light chill to settle in, and I had a sweater wrapped around me as I sat curled up on the couch. I was 23, living in a small two-bedroom house with my roommate, Leah. She'd gone out of town for a couple of days to visit family, so I had the place to myself. Honestly, I loved the quiet nights alone. No one to talk to, no one to disturb my routine. I was the kind of person who preferred it. I could watch whatever I wanted without anyone complaining about it, eat whatever I felt like without judgment, and just be completely by myself. I wasn't really focused on the TV show I had on. It was some true crime documentary that had been playing in the background as I mindlessly scrolled through my phone, checking my social media and texting a couple of friends. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the low, muffled voices from the TV. The only light in the room came from the glow of the TV screen, casting strange, flickering shadows on the walls. It was one of those nights where everything felt still, like the world had hit pause. I had my feet tucked under me on the couch, the warmth of my cup of tea beginning to fade as it sat on the coffee table. I hadn't even realized how late it was getting until I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 10:30 p.m. My eyelids felt heavy, the tea no longer working its usual magic, and I found myself zoning out, letting my thoughts wander. That's when I heard it, the knock. It was soft at first, barely a tap, like a hesitant knock from someone unsure if they should even be there. I blinked, pausing the show on the TV and listening intently. The quiet hum of the house seemed to amplify the sound, making it all the more noticeable. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was the wind or a neighbor's door closing. But then it came again, a little louder this time, more urgent. Knock, knock, knock. My heart skipped a beat, the sudden break in the stillness throwing me off. I wasn't expecting anyone. Leah was out of town, and I hadn't made any plans for the evening. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the door. I wasn't sure what to do. Maybe it was delivery, or a neighbor stopping by for some reason. But the more I thought about it, the more I couldn't shake the strange feeling that crept over me. Why was someone knocking at my door this late? And who would come here without texting or calling first? The house felt unusually quiet again, and I could hear the sound of my pulse in my ears. The air was suddenly thick with tension. I tried to push the unease aside, brushing it off as paranoia. After all, I'd lived in this neighborhood for almost 2 years, and nothing ever happened here. It was the kind of neighborhood where you didn't even lock your doors during the day. Safe, comfortable, predictable. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. But despite all that, the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I stood up slowly, my bare feet making soft padding sounds on the hardwood floor as I walked to the door. I wasn't exactly sure what I was expecting, but my hand hovered over the handle for a moment, hesitation creeping into my movements. Knock, knock, knock. It came again, louder this time, almost demanding. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure what it was, but the urgency in the knock left me feeling uneasy. I hadn't heard any cars pulling up outside, no sounds of footsteps, nothing that would indicate someone was outside. The more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. I glanced over at the front window, the heavy curtains slightly drawn. The outside light from the porch bathed the front yard in a soft glow, but I couldn't see anyone standing out there. No car parked in front of the house, no figures moving in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't right. I padded over to the door and peered through the peephole, holding my breath. At first, I saw only the dim outline of someone standing there, their figure almost blending in with the shadows. But as I leaned closer, squinting to make out more details, my stomach twisted. It was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket. It was hard to make out the details through the peephole, but there was something that didn't sit well with me. He had a stern expression on his face, his features shadowed in the dim light. His eyes were hard to read, but he didn't seem like someone I'd recognize. He didn't belong here. He was holding something against his chest, and as I focused on it, I realized it was a badge, a police badge, clipped onto his jacket. My first thought was, okay, maybe it's some kind of officer. Maybe something happened nearby. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't feel entirely relieved. If anything, it felt like the pit in my stomach only deepened. I cautiously opened the door, just a crack, enough to hear him clearly without letting him see the fear that I was trying to hide. His voice was calm and official, with a slight edge of urgency. "Ma'am, I'm with the police," he said, his voice low but firm. "There's a gas leak in the area. We need to evacuate the neighborhood immediately. For your safety, please come with me." His words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. A gas leak? At this hour? Why hadn't I heard anything about it before now? No sirens, no warnings. Just this man showing up at my door, looking like he was about to whisk me away. I glanced at the street outside through the gap in the door. It was still dark, the streetlights casting long shadows across the quiet road. There were no flashing lights, no emergency vehicles parked along the curb, nothing that would indicate a gas leak or even any kind of emergency. I tried to focus on the man in front of me, my mind racing. Something about him didn't feel right. His uniform wasn't quite what I expected. It didn't look like the usual police uniform I'd seen around here. The fabric was a little off, not quite the same shade of blue as the standard police gear. He didn't have any radio equipment, no flashlight, not even a clipboard, just the badge on his chest. Why would he be out here without proper gear? The suspicion grew inside me, pushing aside the feeling of confusion. I wasn't sure what was going on, but my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. My hand hovered over the door, not sure whether to open it further or close it and lock myself in. The man seemed to sense my hesitation. He took a step forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice a little more forceful now. "I really need you to come with me. The situation is urgent." I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't normal. "Could you give me your badge number?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly, trying to sound confident but not fully succeeding. For a split second, the man's expression faltered, just the slightest shift in his posture. He didn't answer immediately. There was a long pause where he seemed to hesitate, and then his eyes narrowed slightly, his face going from polite concern to something darker. "You don't need my badge number," he snapped, tone sharp and impatient. "Kint, just open the door now. It's not safe for you to stay here." I froze. That was it, the shift in his demeanor. It was subtle, but it was there. Something in the way he spoke, in the way his words came out so quickly. It was almost like he was trying to rush me, to pressure me into making a decision without thinking it through. Something inside me screamed not to trust him. My mind raced as I stood there, frozen, with the door cracked open just enough to see him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the cold sweat beginning to form on my palms. He wasn't acting like a police officer should. His attitude had completely changed, going from calm and professional to demanding and forceful. His eyes no longer had that calm, authoritative look I would expect from an officer. Instead, there was something in his gaze, a sharpness and impatience that didn't fit the situation. I instinctively took a step back, pulling the door just a little tighter. "Ma'am, open the door now." His voice grew louder, his words almost shouting now. "I said it's not safe. You don't have time for this." The forcefulness in his voice hit me like a slap. The way he yelled, the way he pounded his fist against the door, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, my heart racing. My mind told me to stay calm, to just think it through. But something wasn't right. Nothing was right about this. The man outside didn't look like a real police officer. I was certain of it now. There were no flashing lights, no emergency vehicles on the street, and his uniform wasn't even correct. As I stood there, my instincts took over. Something inside me told me to not open the door further. I had to trust that gut feeling, but I needed to be sure. I had to ask him something, anything, to confirm who he really was. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I couldn't even find my voice at first. When I finally spoke, it came out in a whisper. "I'm sorry, but can I see your ID? I needed to confirm who you are." The man's expression faltered for just a second, his eyes briefly shifting from annoyance to something that almost looked like confusion. But that moment passed quickly. His mouth tightened into a hard line. The change in his demeanor was subtle but terrifying. It was like he was playing a role, like he was trying to keep his composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. "Ma'am, I don't have time for this," he snapped. His voice was almost threatening now, low and menacing. "You need to come with me. I can't do this all night." And then he did something I wasn't expecting. He pounded on the door with both fists, the force of it making the entire frame rattle. My breath caught in my throat, and my body flinched back from the door and locking it instantly. The sound echoed throughout the house as if the walls themselves were shaking. He wasn't playing games anymore. I could hear his boots stomping against the porch, moving in closer to the door. His breathing had become ragged, almost like he was losing control. The air felt heavy with tension, thick with the rising sense of danger. It was as if everything in the world had narrowed down to this one moment, this one decision. I took a step backward, my legs feeling weak beneath me. I didn't know what was happening, but I couldn't stay here, standing by the door. My instincts screamed at me to get away from it, to lock myself in and call the police. I turned on my heel, my mind racing as I dashed across the living room and toward my bedroom. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking so violently that I almost dropped it. My pulse thundered in my ears as I quickly dialed 911, barely able to steady my breathing long enough to speak. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but I could barely hear it over the pounding in my chest. "There's someone at my door," I managed to gasp. "I think he's pretending to be a cop. He said there's a gas leak, but it doesn't make sense. I don't trust him. He's trying to force his way in." The dispatcher's voice was firm, though there was a hint of urgency in her tone. "Stay calm, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Do not open the door. Lock yourself in a room and stay on the phone with me." I didn't hesitate. I slammed the bedroom door shut and threw the deadbolt, then backed away from it quickly, my mind racing. The phone felt like an anchor in my hand, a lifeline, but my body was frozen in fear. Outside, the sound of his pounding against the door had stopped, but I could hear him moving around, his boots scraping on the wooden porch, the sound of him walking in circles. It sounded like he was searching for a way in, looking for another way to get past me. My mind was spinning, trying to keep up with the situation. The fear was sharp, palpable, but I kept hearing the dispatcher's calm voice in my ear, reminding me to stay calm and wait. It wasn't long before the sound of his footsteps came again, louder this time, closer. He was trying to force his way in. He was trying to break the door down. The distinct sound of kicking came next. The door jolted with each strike. The heavy thuds vibrated through the walls, shaking the windows and making the door creak under the pressure. I could hear the wood groaning under the force, and for a terrifying second, I thought the door was going to give. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I had to do something, but I didn't know what. I pressed myself into the corner of the room, gripping the phone tightly, unable to pull my eyes away from the door. Every kick felt like it was aimed directly at my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't focus on anything other than the terrifying sound of the man trying to get in. The panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I knew I couldn't lose control. I needed to stay calm. The kicking continued for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a matter of minutes. The sound of the doorknob rattling violently, the thud of his boots, and the scraping of something metal against the wood. It was all I could hear, all I could focus on. And then, silence. The quiet that followed was unnerving. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged in the stillness. My eyes darted from the door to the window, my heart pounding so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. The seconds ticked by like hours. I didn't dare move. I waited, listening for any sound, anything that could indicate where he was. My muscles ached from the tension, but I didn't dare let my guard down. And then the motion light in the backyard flicked on. My stomach dropped like a stone into my gut. I hadn't heard any footsteps approaching, no sounds of movement at all. But there it was, bright light flooding the yard. I crept over to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. My hands were clammy as I pulled the blinds aside just a fraction of an inch. There, at the edge of the yard, I could see a shadow. A figure moving just beyond the light, creeping closer to the back door. It was him. He was trying to get in through the back now. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, my heart racing. I couldn't believe this was happening. I couldn't believe how close I was to being trapped in my own home. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I clutched my phone tighter. My mind was spinning. What should I do? Should I try to escape? The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls of the house were closing in. The sound of the motion light buzzing faintly in the background was the only sound that filled the otherwise unnerving silence. I couldn't see him clearly, but I could hear the faint crunch of gravel under his boots, the soft scrape of him inching closer to the back door. Panic surged through me, and my heart hammered so violently in my chest I thought it might burst. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run leave to find safety, but I was frozen in place. The weight of the situation, the overwhelming sense that this man, this intruder, was getting closer, was too much. I could feel it, like a dark cloud pressing down on me. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of sirens. At first, it was faint, a distant hum in the night air, but it quickly grew louder and relief flooded through me. Real police, the flashing lights, the sirens, they were here. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my voice shaky as I whispered into the receiver, "They're here. Please tell them to hurry." The dispatcher, still calm and steady, reassured me. "Stay where you are. We've got units on the scene. Officers will be there in moments. Stay inside." But I wasn't sure I could stay inside much longer. My mind raced as I heard the sirens growing louder, the sound of police cars pulling up outside, the screech of tires, and the sharp burst of commands from loudspeakers. "This is the police. Step away from the property. Now!" The voice was loud and forceful, echoing through the night like a command straight from hell. It was the sound of authority, the sound of safety. I crept back to the window, my heart still thudding in my chest. My eyes widened as I saw a shadow move away from the back door, the figure clearly visible in the glow of the flashing red and blue lights. For the briefest second, I thought he might try to run. But then, in the blink of an eye, I saw several uniformed officers swarm into the yard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They moved with purpose, surrounding the man who had been creeping closer and closer to my door. It was like something out of a movie, except this wasn't make-believe. This was real. The officer nearest to the man shouted, "Get on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" Before I could even process what was happening, I watched in disbelief as the man was tackled to the ground, a knife falling from his hand and skittering across the gravel. The officers quickly handcuffed him, their movements swift and practiced. The man didn't put up much of a fight. He was no longer the confident, intimidating figure he had been outside my door. Now he was nothing more than a desperate, trembling man being subdued by the real police. I stood there, my face pressed against the cool window pane, watching as the officers stood over him. I felt a strange sense of relief flood through me, but it was mixed with something else, something darker. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized how close I had come to opening that door, to trusting a complete stranger who had been pretending to be a cop. How close I had come to falling victim to his ruse. I opened the door slowly. I could see them now in the light. Real officers with their badges, their radios, and their proper uniforms. I felt a wave of relief, but it was tinged with the lingering adrenaline from the events that had just unfolded. I told them everything. The man at the door, the strange behavior, how he had tried to force his way in. They nodded along, taking notes and asking more questions. This wasn't just a random incident. The officers explained that this man had been doing this to several houses in the area, posing as a police officer, claiming some kind of emergency like a gas leak, and tricking people into opening their doors so he could rob them or worse. He'd been using the fake excuse to find victims who were home alone, just like me. As they explained it all, my stomach turned. I couldn't believe how close I had come to letting him in, to trusting him. But in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't luck that kept me safe. It was my instinct. The voice in my head that told me something wasn't right. The voice that told me not to open that door further. The officers finally left, taking the man into custody. I stood there on my front porch, watching as they loaded him into the back of a patrol car. My hands were still shaking, but I was finally starting to breathe again. The sirens had faded, the flashing lights were gone, and the neighborhood had returned to its eerie stillness. The quiet that had once felt peaceful now felt strange, almost oppressive. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The warmth of the house, the soft glow of the lamps in the living room, it all felt so safe, so normal again. But I knew things had changed. I knew that I could never look at my front door the same way again. The incident stayed with me long after it was over, and more than anything, I knew that from that moment on I would never open the door for anyone without absolute proof of who they were. I had trusted my instincts, and they had saved me that night. I wouldn't ignore them again. My name is Alex, and I work as a night janitor at a small, mid-sized office building tucked away in a quiet, somewhat industrial part of Los Angeles. I know, it doesn't sound like the most glamorous job in the world, but it's simple, pays the bills, and leaves me plenty of time to myself. You wouldn't believe how often people think cleaning offices at night is just about wiping down desks and taking out the trash. There's actually a lot more to it than that. Especially when you're the last one in the building, walking through empty hallways at the dead of night. It's eerie, but I've grown used to it. In a strange way, I almost find it comforting. No phones ringing, no emails to check, no annoying chatter from coworkers. Just the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning and the distant flicker of old fluorescent lights above me. I've been at this job for about a year now, and honestly, most nights blend together in a haze of monotony. There's something about this place, though, something that always gives me an odd feeling when I'm walking through the corridors alone. Maybe it's the creaky floors or the way the shadows seem to stretch a little too long, but most of the time it's manageable. The the building itself is a bit of a relic, built in the early 80s. 4 floors, and each one is pretty much the same. The walls are all beige, the carpet worn and stained in places, and the outdated elevator system is slow as molasses. I've learned every nook and cranny of the place, including the stairwell, which I usually take when I'm moving between floors. It's narrow, with low ceilings and no windows, so it feels like you're walking through some hidden passageway, the kind of place you would expect to find in a thriller movie. The office space, for the most part, isn't very well kept either. The cleaning supplies are all in a utility closet on the second floor, tucked away in a small room that no one ever seems to use. I've got my own set of routines: sweep, mop, take out the trash, wipe down the desks, and move on. The kind of thing that lets my mind wander a bit, but not too much. Just enough to keep me going, to let the hours pass. Now, when I first started working here, I didn't think much of the quiet nights. Sure, the silence can feel suffocating at times, but I didn't think anything particularly strange was going on. It was just an old office building full of empty cubicles, stacked chairs, and abandoned coffee mugs. After a while, I stopped noticing the little things. The way the building always seemed to groan when no one was around, the way the temperature seemed to drop at random in certain areas. But tonight, this night, was different. It was past midnight, maybe 1 a.m., and I was on my last round of cleaning for the night. I had finished up the third floor, and all that was left was the second. The second floor is usually the quietest. It's mostly just empty offices that no one uses anymore. Most of the workers who come in late are on the higher floors, so I'm rarely interrupted. It's almost too quiet down there, but at this hour, it's kind of comforting. The only sound is the swish of my mop on the floor and the occasional soft buzz from the vending machine in the corner of the lobby. I was halfway through the second floor hallway when I noticed something out of place. A faint light was spilling from beneath the door of one of the side offices. I knew it was supposed to be locked. It always is. The office, number 211, is an old conference room that gets used once in a blue moon. It's never open when I come around to clean, and I'm usually the last one to lock up the place. At first, I figured it was nothing. Maybe a coworker had forgotten to lock it or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That small sliver of light, the kind of light that shouldn't be there at this hour, seemed wrong somehow. It stood out in the dim hallway, making the shadows feel deeper than usual. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, this was the kind of thing that happened every once in a while. But something made me stop and look again. I walked over slowly, my sneakers making a soft squeak against the waxed floor. I could feel my heartbeat quicken for some reason, though I couldn't explain why. My breath seemed to get a little heavier, and I had this tight knot in my stomach, like something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. I leaned closer to the door, peering through the small crack that had been left open. The door itself was metal, the kind with a solid handle that you can't just open without turning the knob. What I saw inside made my stomach drop. At first, I couldn't quite make it out. The office was dimly lit, the single overhead light casting shadows that made everything appear blurry. But then my eyes focused, and I saw a figure, crouched behind the desk. A man. My heart nearly stopped. For a second, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe someone had gotten into the building after hours, some homeless person looking for shelter. But no, this wasn't just any person. His clothes were dark, a wrinkled shirt and pants that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. His hair was unkempt, wild, as if it hadn't seen a comb in months. But what really made me freeze was what he was holding. In his hand, gripped tightly, was something gleaming in the dim light. Something sharp. A knife. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen, and I could feel the cold sweat starting to bead on the back of my neck. I should have turned and walked away right then, should have backed out slowly and called the police from a safe distance. But I didn't. Something, stupidly, told me that maybe I could handle this. Maybe he was just some lost soul who'd wandered in and didn't know what he was doing. Maybe he was harmless. But that feeling, that sinking feeling in my stomach, wouldn't go away. I stepped forward slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I pushed the door open a little more, but I was careful not to make it swing too far. I needed to get a better look at him to figure out what was going on. But as soon as I did, I saw his eyes. They were wide, almost too wide, like he was staring at something I couldn't see. And then, suddenly, he looked directly at me. The chill that ran through me wasn't just fear. It was a primal instinct, telling me to get out, to run, but I didn't move. And that's when he made his move. Everything after that happened so fast, I barely had time to react. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I thought I was going to pass out right there. My body was frozen, like some primal part of me knew exactly how bad this situation was. He didn't speak. He didn't move for a moment, but there was something in the way he looked at me, something that sent a shiver through my spine. It was as though he was sizing me up, deciding if I was a threat or not. And then, without warning, he lunged. I barely had time to process what was happening. His movements were fast, too fast. In an instant, he was no longer crouched behind the desk. He was charging at me, his hands outstretched, the knife gleaming under the dim light. I instinctively stepped backward, but my foot caught on something, maybe a chair or the mop bucket I'd left behind. Whatever it was, it sent me sprawling to the floor. The sound of the chair scraping across the floor as I fell felt deafening, and for a split second, I thought he might have heard it too. My breath was coming in short, panicked gasps, my heart pounding in my chest as I scrambled backward. I couldn't even think straight. All I could focus on was getting away from him. I wasn't a fighter. I wasn't prepared for this. I was just a janitor, doing my shift, minding my own business. But he didn't seem to care about any of that. His eyes were locked onto me, and there was nothing but malice in them. I finally managed to push myself to my feet, my hands shaking as I grabbed at my keys. I could feel the slickness of sweat on my palms, but I didn't stop moving. I turned on my heels and ran. My feet pounded against the floor, the sound echoing through the hallway as I sprinted toward the stairwell. I could hear him behind me. His footsteps were heavy and relentless, getting closer with each passing second. I didn't even look back. I just had to make it to the stairs, to the exit. I had to get out. As I reached the stairwell door, I didn't bother to stop and check if he was still behind me. I threw the door open and bolted down the stairs. The building was silent, save for the sound of my footsteps clattering down the concrete steps. The stairwell was narrow, the walls close and oppressive. My breath was ragged, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. I couldn't seem to get enough air, but I didn't stop running. Not even for a second. My mind was a blur, only focused on the goal. Get out. Get to safety. But with each floor I descended, I realized just how far I was from the lobby, how far I was from the front door. By the time I reached the ground floor, my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was almost there, just a few more feet to the lobby. I could see the faint light from the lobby's exit doors, just a sliver of warmth in the cold, empty building. But when I burst into the lobby, expecting to see the night security guard sitting at the front desk, I was met with something far worse. The desk was empty. I skidded to a halt, heart in my throat. My mind raced. Where was the guard? This was never the case. He's always there, watching the monitors, even if he wasn't actively patrolling. The lobby should have been his domain. He was supposed to be my safety net. But there was no sign of him, no sign of anyone. The place was dead silent, save for the low hum of the vending machines in the corner. I didn't stop to think. I couldn't. Panic surged in my chest. The man was still out there, and now I had no idea where he was. Was he still following me? Had he given up? I spun around, scanning the lobby for any sign of movement. The front door was just a few feet away. I could make it. If I could just get to the doors, get outside, I could get to my car. The glass doors were locked, but the emergency exit was to my right. I bolted toward it, my hands fumbling for the door handle. My head was spinning. I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I had to get out. I pushed the door open, hearing the faint click of the mechanism as the door swung wide. The cool night air hit me like a wave, refreshing but terrifying at the same time. It was empty out here, the parking lot bathed in the pale light of the street lamps. I could see my car parked near the far end of the lot, its headlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The sense of relief that washed over me was short-lived, though, when I heard it. The footsteps. They were still behind me. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder, and my blood ran cold. The man wasn't chasing me anymore. No, he was standing in the doorway of the building, just inside. He was watching me. Not moving, not making a sound, but his eyes never left me. I couldn't make out the expression on his face, whether he was waiting or if he was just trying to gauge what I'd do next. But the sight of him standing there, motionless, sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and ran for my car, every step feeling like I was dragging my feet through quicksand. My heart was racing, blood pounding in my ears, and I could hear his footsteps behind me again, only quieter now, like he was still there, lurking in the background. I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. The cold metal felt slippery against my fingers, and for a moment I thought I was going to drop them. My breath was coming in short gasps, my chest tight with panic, and I finally got the door open. I slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I didn't waste any time. I started the engine, my hands shaking as I pressed my foot to the gas. The tires screeched as I sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look in my rearview mirror, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Still waiting. I dialed 911 the second I was out of the lot, my hands trembling as I told the operator everything that had happened. The dispatcher stayed calm, reassuring me that help was on the way, but I couldn't stop shaking. I felt sick to my stomach, like I'd narrowly escaped something I wasn't prepared to face. But no matter how much I tried to calm down, I couldn't shake the image of his face, his cold, unblinking stare as he watched me from the doorway. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how close I had come to something much worse. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, and by that point, I was a wreck. My hands were still shaking and my thoughts were all over the place. I sat in my car, parked across the street from the building, too terrified to get out, too paranoid to look anywhere but straight ahead. I kept expecting to see the man appear in the parking lot, walking calmly toward me, his knife still in his hand. I could barely explain what had happened when the officers arrived. It was hard to put into words the way my body had frozen when I saw him behind that desk, the way he had moved at me with such speed, as though he was waiting for that exact moment. When I told them about the knife, they looked at each other, but didn't say anything. They were used to hearing strange stories, but I could see it in their eyes. This was more than just some random break-in or trespassing case. We headed back to the building and they started their investigation. They checked the stairwell, the hallways, every office. I stayed outside, pacing, feeling sick to my stomach. The last thing I wanted was to be inside that building again, even with the police. I didn't want to face what I knew was still lurking in there. When they reviewed the security footage, things got worse, much worse. They showed me the tapes from the cameras in the building. I was expecting to see the man entering the building after hours or maybe sneaking into one of the offices. But what they found made my blood run cold. The footage from the previous day showed the man entering the building during the late afternoon, right when most of the employees had left. He wasn't seen immediately, though. He was smart. He'd waited until everyone was gone. The cameras caught him slipping into an unused storage room on the third floor, carrying nothing but a duffel bag. I didn't see him leave again until later that night. The worst part? He knew the building's schedule. He knew the exact times I would be cleaning. He knew the weak spots, the places where the cameras didn't cover. They searched the building top to bottom, checking every door, every window, but the man had vanished into the night. Just like that. There were no signs of him anywhere. But that wasn't the end. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had caught him. And to my absolute horror, they discovered that the security guard who was supposed to be watching the building that night was in on it with him. They had been planning something bigger, something more sinister. The guard, who I had trusted to keep an eye on the place, had been part of the plan the whole time. They had been working together to rob the building, and I was nothing more than a pawn in their twisted game. The police didn't go into too much detail, but they told me the guard had been feeding information to the man, tipping him off about my cleaning schedule and the times when the building would be empty. They had been planning to ambush me, to overpower me, and I still shudder to think what might have happened if I had stayed just a few minutes longer. What if I hadn't run? What if I hadn't noticed him before it was too late? I can't help but think about that night, about the decisions I made in the heat of the moment. It's hard to shake the feeling that I was just inches away from something far worse. Maybe if I had stayed, I wouldn't be here, telling you this story at all. But that's the thing about fear, isn't it? It's not about the things you can see. It's about the things you can't. The things you know are out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And sometimes they're closer than you think, closer than you could ever imagine. I've never been one to sleep soundly, not even in the most peaceful moments. Every creak in the house, every rustle of the wind outside, even the distant hum of traffic, anything could wake me up, especially in the dead of night. It's something I'd gotten used to living alone, in a cheap house in a quieter part of California. There's a certain stillness to these small aging complexes, almost too quiet for comfort. You can hear the echo of your own thoughts, the silence pressing in from every corner. That night, though, something felt off. It was just past 2 a.m. when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. My eyes fluttered open slowly, my head thick with the remnants of a restless sleep. For a few moments, I lay still in the darkness, trying to get my bearings, letting the fog of sleep lift. But the feeling hit me then. A strange discomfort creeping up my spine, making my heart beat just a little faster than usual. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing. The house was always quiet, too quiet. I've lived here for over a year, and despite the slightly sketchy neighborhood, I'd never had any real trouble. No one had ever tried to break in, and honestly, I never had any reason to believe anyone would. Still, the unease lingered. That odd feeling of being watched, like someone was there, just outside the edge of my awareness, sitting still, waiting for something. I shifted in bed, turning over to face the window. The faint glow of the streetlights outside filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. The window was always locked at night, a routine I never broke. I did it automatically, as instinctual as brushing my teeth before bed. The thought of leaving it even slightly ajar felt wrong to me, but now I could feel the cool air, a breeze against my face. I blinked, confused, still half dazed from sleep. The window, I squinted into the dim light, trying to make sense of it. Sure enough, the window was open. Just an inch or so, but enough to let that chill in. My heart skipped a beat, the blood rushing to my ears. I wasn't imagining it. The window was open. I sat up slowly, trying to calm myself. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly, I thought, trying to rationalize. After all, I'd been tired when I closed it earlier. Maybe I didn't push it all the way into the lock, or maybe, just maybe, I was overthinking it. But the air was cold now, seeping into the room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I always checked the windows. I always made sure everything was secure before I went to bed. This didn't feel like one of those occasional slip-ups, the kind you make when you're half asleep. I swung my legs off the bed, my feet meeting the cold hardwood floor with a soft thud. The house was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that only comes in the dead of night. There were no sounds of traffic, no chatter from neighbors, nothing but the dull hum of electricity and the occasional rustle of wind outside. I had to check. I had to know. I stood in the darkness for a moment, my gaze still locked on the window. The curtains swayed slightly, the faintest movement stirring the stillness. The streetlights outside created faint patterns on the wall, casting long shadows that stretched across the room. I felt like the shadows were somehow watching me, like they were waiting for me to make a move. But I forced myself to take a step forward. My heart raced as I walked toward the window. Every step felt deliberate, measured. My skin tingled with a mixture of fear and curiosity, my mind replaying every horror story I'd heard about break-ins, intruders. I tried to shake off the thought, but it stuck to me like a thick fog. I reached for the window. The air coming through the gap was icy cold, more than it should have been for a spring night in California. I placed my hand on the frame, and it felt like the metal had been exposed to the night air for hours, chilled and unwelcoming. I closed my eyes for a second, bracing myself for whatever I was about to discover. I was hoping, desperately hoping, that I had simply forgotten to latch it properly, that there was some logical explanation. But when I pushed the window open just a little bit more, my pulse quickened. It didn't seem like something I had done. I could feel it now, the unmistakable sense that someone had been here, or worse, was still here. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer, squinting into the darkness outside. Everything looked normal. The narrow alley beneath my window was empty, the dim lights of the street casting long shadows across the pavement. The quiet hum of the city was barely audible from here, the kind of stillness that only came in the dead of night. Nothing moved. There were no sounds. But the feeling of someone's eyes on me, hadn't gone away. It only grew stronger. It wasn't just the window. It was something deeper, something primal. Before I could pull away, something made my heart freeze in place. There was a sudden shift in the air, a subtle shift, but it was enough. My instincts screamed at me, my body going rigid, and then it happened. A hand shot out of the darkness outside. A long, pale hand with fingers so long and thin they looked almost unnatural. It gripped my wrist like a vice, its coldness sending a jolt of panic through me. I gasped, my heart skipping in my chest, the world tilting on its axis for a split second. It was so fast, the kind of speed that made everything feel unreal, like I was caught in some nightmare, unable to wake up. I didn't have time to think. I didn't even have time to react. The hand tightened, fingers digging into my skin with bone-crushing force. The coldness seeped through my sleeve, making my skin crawl. The grip was so tight, so inhumanly strong, that I felt like I was being pulled toward the window, as if someone was trying to drag me out of my house. My breath caught in my throat, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to get away from that hand. I twisted my wrist, fighting to free myself, but it didn't budge. The panic surged within me, each second feeling like a lifetime. My vision blurred, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything, to escape. but all I could hear was my own frantic breathing and the low, guttural rasp of something or someone on the other side of the window. And then, through the glass, I heard it. A whisper. It wasn't clear at first, just a soft sound that seemed to echo from the shadows, but it was there. A low, hoarse whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. The words were muffled, and I couldn't make them out, but there was something about the voice that made my skin crawl. It was like a command, like the voice of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I was no longer thinking. My body acted on pure instinct. I pulled with every ounce of strength I had, desperate to free myself from the unrelenting grip. I twisted and jerked, throwing all my weight into the motion, until, finally, the hand loosened. I wasn't about to wait to see if it would come back. Without thinking, I slammed the window shut as hard as I could. The sound of glass meeting metal was deafening, and for a brief second, I thought I might have crushed something on the other side. Maybe the fingers. I didn't care. I locked the window immediately, hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled with the latch. My mind raced, the fear still gripping my chest. My wrist burned from where the hand had held me, and I could feel the faint bruises already beginning to form beneath my skin. I stumbled backward, my breath shallow and ragged. My entire body was shaking now, my legs weak as I backed away from the window, never once taking my eyes off of it. It felt as though something or someone was still there, waiting. I didn't know what to do next. My head was spinning, the room closing in on me. I couldn't stop looking at the window. Like if I did, I'd somehow miss something. But I couldn't stay in that room. Not anymore. I stood there for what felt like an eternity. The cold air still seeping through the crack in the window, even though it was shut tight now. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears, making everything feel too loud, too intense. The fear was so thick, it almost felt tangible, like I could reach out and touch it. My body was rigid, my mind racing in 100 different directions. What just happened? Was it real? I couldn't stop thinking about the hand, the way it had grabbed me, the coldness of it, how fast it had happened. It didn't feel like a person from the street trying to break in. It felt wrong. It was like something else entirely, something that didn't belong here. My wrist still throbbed where the hand had held me, the skin tender and swollen. I flexed my fingers, trying to shake the sensation, but it was still there, the eerie feeling of that grip. It felt like the hand had left a part of itself on me, a mark I couldn't escape. I forced myself to move, to think, to act. My phone. I needed to call someone. 911. I couldn't believe I hadn't done it yet. I had been too frozen, too paralyzed by the shock of it all. I needed to get help. I needed someone to tell me that everything was going to be okay, that this was just some strange accident, a mistake. I walked shakily to the nightstand, my feet dragging across the floor, barely aware of my movements. My fingers were trembling so badly that it took several tries to unlock my phone. I didn't care about the stupid lock screen. My thumb swiped wildly across the screen as I frantically searched for the emergency number. 911. Dial! Dial! Damn it! The phone rang in my ear, the sound echoing through the silent room, too loud for how quiet everything else felt. My throat was dry, tight with fear, and I could barely make myself speak. I pressed the phone to my ear, clutching it like a lifeline, but when the dispatcher answered, my voice came out a strangled whisper. "There's someone outside my window," I managed to gasp. I don't know who, but they tried to grab me. Please. Please send someone now." My words tumbled out in a panicked rush. It felt like I couldn't breathe, like the room was closing in on me, squeezing out all the air. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and I needed to be out of that house. I needed to be anywhere but here. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm for my liking. It was like they were trying to keep me grounded, trying to steady my shaking hands with their steady words. "Stay inside. Do not approach the window. Officers are on their way. Keep your doors locked and make sure you're in a safe place. Safe place? How could I feel safe now? The thought of staying in that house, knowing that someone had been outside, waiting, was enough to send my blood into a cold rush. I barely nodded, though I knew the dispatcher couldn't see me. I backed away from the window, my eyes still glued to it. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever had been out there was still lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for me to make another mistake, waiting for me to slip up again. I pressed my back against the farthest wall of my bedroom, my hands shaking as I held the phone in front of me like a shield. The dispatcher kept talking, trying to calm me down, but I couldn't focus on their words. My mind kept drifting back to the image of that hand reaching through the window, the cold fingers wrapping around my wrist, the low guttural whisper that sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the window again, terrified that the fingers would appear again, pressing against the glass. The silence was unbearable now. Every tiny sound in the room felt magnified. The creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, the soft hum of the fridge in the next room, the rustling of the wind outside, carrying with it the occasional leaf scraping across the sidewalk. I could hear it all. It was as if my senses were heightened, and yet all I wanted was for everything to be quiet, for everything to stop moving. But the silence persisted, and it gnawed at me. Something was coming. I didn't know what, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Something was still out there. And then, just when I thought I might crack, I heard the faintest sound. It wasn't loud, barely audible, but it was enough to make my pulse spike again. Thump! It was barely a sound, almost imperceptible. It came from the alley beneath my window. I stiffened, listening harder, straining my ears to make sense of it. Was it just the wind? A stray animal? My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the thump had been too deliberate to be an accident. It sounded like footsteps, like someone was pacing. Slowly, methodically. I was frozen in place, my body unable to move, paralyzed by fear. The seconds dragged by like hours, the sound of the footsteps growing louder, closer, until I could almost feel them in my bones. They stopped just beneath my window. I wasn't sure if I was breathing at all anymore. My heart was hammering so loudly in my ears that I couldn't hear anything else. Then came the voice. It was low, raspy, too quiet for me to make out at first, but it was unmistakably there. The whispering again. This time it sounded closer, too close. Like someone was just outside the glass, their lips brushing against the window. I nearly dropped the phone. My eyes snapped to the window, and I could see nothing. Just the shadows of the alley cast by the weak light of the street lamp. The whispers continued, but this time they were so muffled that they sounded more like a growl than words. A voice that didn't belong. It felt wrong. Something was out there. Something that wasn't supposed to be. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. And yet it didn't stop. The whispers, the pacing, the sounds of someone lingering just outside my window. It felt like hours passed. Maybe it was only minutes, but the world seemed to slow down, each second stretching out, each breath a battle against the suffocating fear that threatened to swallow me whole. Finally, the sirens broke the tension. The distant wail of the police cars echoed in the silence, growing louder as they approached. I held my breath, praying that help was finally here. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone again, but it was muffled. The officers are on their way. Stay inside. Don't... The line went dead. My fingers were numb. The phone slipped from my grasp and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I barely noticed it. I was too focused on the sounds coming from outside. The footsteps stopped. The whispers stopped. Everything was still. The stillness that followed was unbearable. I was too terrified to move. My back pressed against the wall, my knees shaky and weak beneath me, but I couldn't make myself step away from the corner of the room. My breath came in shallow, jagged gasps, each inhale feeling like it might be my last. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to escape, but the thought of stepping out into the hallway past the front door was even worse. I didn't know if I'd be able to make it to safety. The police were coming. I had to hold on. They were almost here. I repeated it over and over in my head, trying to hold on to that thread of hope, but the longer I waited, the more my mind drifted into darker thoughts. What if they were already too late? What if whatever was out there had already gone, leaving me behind, too terrified to move? What if I was just imagining everything? I didn't know what to believe anymore. The streetlights outside blinked on and off in a dull, almost mocking rhythm, their faint glow slipping through the blinds and casting long shadows on the walls. I could hear the faint hum of electricity in the building, the occasional clink of a car passing down the street, but still, the silence in my house seemed all-encompassing. Then came the knock. Knock. The sound was sudden, jarring. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It came from the door, quick and sharp, followed by a muffled voice. "Police. Are you inside? Open the door." I stood there, frozen, for several long seconds. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Was it really the police, or was it just another trick? My mind raced. I had heard so many stories of people pretending to be someone they weren't, gaining access to homes just by making a sound or asking for help. But then I heard the sound of the sirens getting closer, the rush of several police cars now idling on the street outside. Police. I didn't have time to think it over any longer. I scrambled to my feet, my legs unsteady as I rushed to the door. I fumbled with the lock for a few moments before finally yanking it open. A pair of officers stood there, one of them tall with a stern face, the other shorter, eyes darting around the hallway with visible concern. "Are you all right?" the taller officer asked, his voice low but authoritative. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. I felt numb. My head spun, and I could hardly focus on what they were saying. My mind kept drifting back to the window. "Ma'am?" the officer asked again, snapping me back to reality. I nodded, but it felt like the world around me was slipping. I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. I wanted to tell them everything, but the words stuck in my throat, tangled in my panic. The officers exchanged a glance, and the shorter one stepped forward, his eyes scanning the house, clearly uneasy. "Can you tell us what happened?" the tall officer asked again, more gently this time. I nodded and shakily began recounting everything that had happened, the feeling of someone watching me, the hand reaching in through the window, the cold fingers that gripped my wrist, the whispers in the dark. I wasn't sure if I was making sense. It all sounded insane, even to my own ears. How could someone, anyone, believe me? How could I even believe it? When I finished, the officers were quiet for a moment, as if processing everything I had said. The taller officer motioned toward the shorter one, and they both moved toward the window. I stood there in the hallway, watching them, my body still trembling, still feeling the phantom grip of that hand around my wrist. The officer closest to the window knelt down, scanning the ground outside for anything unusual. His face remained impassive, but I saw his eyes narrow as he studied the ground. "Footprints," he muttered. The other officer crouched down next to him, his flashlight sweeping over the dirt beneath the window. There were faint marks in the soil, small indentations where someone had clearly been standing. As I stared at them, a chill ran down my spine. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. The officer stood up, his face grim. "There's something else," he said softly. "Cigarette butts. A couple of them. It's clear someone was waiting out here for a while." But they didn't find anyone. No one was standing there now. No one lurking in the shadows, watching. There was no sign of any person. No evidence that anyone had been near the window, except for those footprints and the discarded cigarettes. For a moment, I wondered if I had somehow imagined it all. But then I remembered the feel of that cold hand wrapping around my wrist, the way it felt like something was waiting for me. The whispers, the presence that had filled the room, suffocating me. The officers took my statement, asking if I had any enemies, anyone who might want to harm me. I shook my head, my mind still foggy from the terror of it all. I lived alone. I kept to myself. I had no reason to believe anyone would target me, at least not in this way. "We'll file a report," the officer said, his voice calm but with an edge of concern. "We'll increase patrols in this area. Keep an eye out. You might want to get some security cameras installed, just to be safe." I nodded numbly, barely able to process his words. The officers left a few moments later, promising to keep an eye on things. They reminded me again to keep the windows locked, to stay alert, and to call 911 if I saw anything unusual. As I watched them drive away, the flashing red and blue lights fading into the distance, I felt a strange emptiness settle over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I didn't know if I would ever feel safe again. Not in this house. Not with what I had felt and seen. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. And for days after, I kept the curtains closed. I locked the windows, triple-checked the doors. I didn't care if it was bright daylight outside. I still felt the weight of those unseen eyes on me. It wasn't the kind of fear you could simply talk away. It lingered, creeping into every quiet moment. I had always known this neighborhood wasn't the safest. But what I hadn't known was how much darkness could live just outside the thin walls of a quiet house. What I hadn't known was how terrifying it was to feel like you're never truly alone. Someone had been out there. Someone had been waiting. And if I hadn't woken up that night, I don't think I'd ever want to find out what would have happened next. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.